They said the bells were only meant to call the faithful, yet their tolls reached beyond the living, and those who heard them after midnight swore the sound pressed against their ribs like a hand from inside the chest. The first time the bells rang, it was in the last days of summer, when the air hung too still and the sky clung too low. The orphanage lay on the hill's crooked shoulder, a house of stone and prayer, where silence was kept like a second vow. The sisters moved as shadows, their veils whispering in rhythm with the candle flames, their rosaries clinking like distant chains. But that night, after the last prayer, after every window had been latched and the children had sunk into uneasy sleep, the sound came. A single toll, slow and swollen, echoing through the halls as though the tower above had been split by thunder. The sisters froze. No hand touched the rope. No priest had entered the grounds. Yet the bell swung, unseen, as though the weight of something unspeakable had set it in motion. The children stirred in their beds, some weeping, some covering their ears, as though the sound was not only heard but felt. A vibration in the marrow, a call that burrowed under the skin. "Do not speak of it," whispered Sister Amada, her voice a hiss, clutching her crucifix, until her knuckles blanched. "But it rang," replied a girl in the dark, her eyes too wide, her voice too steady. "It rang for us." The sisters walked the halls with lanterns that night, the flames wavering as though some draught passed through stone itself. And with every swing of the light, the scent grew stronger, iron, hot and metallic, like blood newly spilled, mixed with the bitter bite of burning oil. No lamp had fallen, no fire had started, yet the fragrance clung as though it oozed from the mortar. At dawn the tower stood still, the rope hung limp, untouched. Dust lay unbroken on the wooden stairs, yet every sister carried the sound in her skull, as though the toll had stitched itself into memory. On the second night, the bells rang again, not once but thrice, each toll lower, heavier, as if the sound was sinking through the world. The children pressed against each other, trembling, their lips moving in broken prayers. "They're not calling us to mass," muttered one boy, eyes glassy in terror. "Then who are they calling?" asked another. No sister answered. The air thickened. The corridors grew colder than stone should allow, breath fogging as though the orphanage were sinking into winter. From the chapel a candle sputtered, yet it had not been lit. Wax began to drip onto the altar cloth, though no flame touched it. Some swore they saw a figure in the belfry, a nun in black who stood without moving, her face veiled, her hands gripping nothing. Others claimed the bell itself swayed without sound when watched, only releasing its voice when unseen. By the third night, no one slept. The children huddled together, shivering, their eyes darting to the ceiling at every creak. The sisters paced the halls, muttering psalms, though the words faltered as if they did not belong here. The toll came at the hour between days, when night is most fragile, when even shadows hesitate to move. 1, 2, 3, 4. The orphanage shook with it. Plaster cracked, candles guttered. The iron smell poured thicker, coating the tongue, souring the stomach. Some of the children vomited. Others screamed without sound, clutching their throats. The sisters rushed to the tower at last, lanterns swinging, rosaries clattering. Yet the stairway was wrong. The steps seemed longer. The climb stretched beyond reason, and with every step, the toll grew softer, as if receding farther away. At the top, the belfry door hung open. No wind stirred it, no rope waited within. Only the bell, vast and still, as though it had never moved. But on the floor beneath it lay footprints, wet and dark, too small to belong to a nun, too fragile to be anything but a child's. And then, without a hand, without a rope, without warning, the bell swung once more, and the sound tore through. The bones of every living thing inside the orphanage, the lanterns blew out. The children screamed, and in the pitch-dark tower a voice whispered from the empty air, "It is not for the living." The sisters fled, but the toll followed them down the stairs, echoing behind, until the very stones seemed to breathe with it. And in the dormitory where the children huddled in terror, one bed lay empty, the sheet still warm, the pillow still indented with the shape of a head. The bells rang again, louder now, as though rejoicing, and the air filled with the scent of iron. The corridor was never meant for wandering. yet at night it stretched longer than any measure of stone, and those who entered swore they heard the shuffle of tiny soles pressed against silence. At dawn, the sisters found them, one by one, scattered, yet arranged with strange deliberation. A neat procession of children's shoes resting along the corridor wall, tiny boots with broken laces, scuffed slippers worn thin at the heel, a pair so small it could not have belonged to any girl yet, grown enough to walk. They were not thrown or forgotten, but placed, aligned as if waiting for inspection. Each shoe still carried the warmth of flesh, as if taken off moments before. Yet no doors stood open, no blankets lay disturbed. The beds in the dormitory remained, filled with bodies that slept too deeply, their mouths slack, their breath shallow, their dreams clinging like cobwebs. Not one child confessed to leaving her bed, not one child admitted the shoes were hers. "Who placed them here?" whispered Sister Amada, her voice splintering like dry wood. "They walked themselves," a child answered, eyes wide, voice hollow. The corridor stretched past the locked chamber, a place forbidden to all but the Mother Superior. The door was thick oak bound with iron, its key heavy as a relic, said to hang always from her belt. Yet the shoes gathered there nightly, multiplying in quiet ranks, lining the floor as though summoned by an invisible hand. On the second morning, there were 12. On the third, 23. By the fifth, the count reached 30, each pair smaller than the last. They did not match the number of children in the orphanage. There were more, always more. The sisters grew pale. Their lips, pressed together in prayers too thin to hold weight. The Mother Superior said nothing. She walked the hall with her veil drawn low, her rosary clutched so tightly the beads cracked beneath her grip. Yet in the silence after Compline, when the lamps dimmed, the sisters swore they heard the scuff of soles upon the stones, dragging, halting, hesitant. The children whispered among themselves. They said the shoes belonged to those who had already been taken. "Taken where?" one girl asked. "To the room," came the answer, though no child admitted to having seen its door open. One night a sister dared to place her lantern at the corridor's mouth, its glow spilling across the line of shoes. The shadows bent too long, too thin. The leather glistened as though wet, though no water darkened the stone. And as the flame flickered, the shoes shifted. Not all at once, but enough. A scrape, a turn, a shuffle forward so slight it could almost be denied. The sister stumbled back, her voice breaking into psalms. She swore she saw the smallest pair tremble, the laces writhing like worms across the floor. When morning came, that pair was gone. The children grew restless. They whispered of hearing voices through the keyhole of the locked chamber, faint murmurs like a lullaby sung beneath the earth. Some claimed to hear weeping, others swore the voices laughed, high and thin, the sound of lungs too small to fill, with air. One boy said he saw pale fingers slip beneath the door, reaching for the shoes as though beckoning. His tale earned him the switch, yet he did not recant. By the seventh night, the corridor was a shrine of absence. 40 shoes now stood in silent testimony, forming a crooked procession that ended at the locked chamber's mouth. The air grew heavier there, damp, saturated with a smell both sweet and rancid, like flowers pressed too long in rot. And then, in the silence before dawn, the bells rang again. 1, 2, 3. The children woke screaming, their eyes rolling as though dreaming while awake. The sisters rushed to the dormitory, lanterns shuddering in their grasp. The beds were filled. The children lay as if asleep. Yet their feet were bare. Every shoe was gone. The sisters ran to the corridor. There they found them, lined not along the walls this time, but gathered at the locked chamber, pressed close against the wood as though demanding entry. Every pair, every last one. The door shook once, twice. The iron bolts rattled, though no key had turned, and from the other side came the faintest sound, unmistakable, undeniable, the scuff of dozens of tiny footsteps pacing, waiting, eager. The Mother Superior lifted her hand, commanding silence. "No one touches that door," she hissed, though her voice trembled, and yet as the lantern light fell, a single shoe slid forward, slow and deliberate, stopping at her feet as though chosen. The air grew tight, heavy, suffocating. Every sister, held her breath. The shoe lay still, but beneath it the stone was wet, dark, seeping, and the trickle crawled forward, tracing the path toward the dormitory, where the children slept without stirring, their mouths open, their breathing shallow as graves. It began with a light that should not have moved, yet it glided through the corridor as though the air itself bore it forward. The lantern was first seen by a girl too young to name what she feared. She woke to a glow outside the dormitory door, faint and trembling, swaying in rhythm with breath that was not there. The flame was pale, not gold, not red, but the color of bone held to moonlight. It did not flicker as other flames did. It pulsed, steady like a heartbeat. She whispered to her bedmate, tugging at her sleeve, pointing with a trembling finger. The other child saw it too. The lantern hovered in silence, then drifted away, deeper into the halls, trailing a smear of dim light upon the stone. They pulled the blankets over their faces, but the glow pressed through the fabric, staining the weave with its pale hue. By morning, they dared not speak of it. Yet whispers spread quickly. By the week's end, every child in the orphanage had heard of the lantern that walked without a hand to carry it. The sisters dismissed it as nonsense, the fevered fancies of children too long in the dark. Yet they too began to see the glow at night. A faint shimmer curling at the corner of the eye, a gleam vanishing when faced. Some claimed it lingered near the locked chamber, circling like a watchful moth. "It is only candlelight spilling from a window," Sister Amada muttered, though no windows faced that hall. "It is a trick of tired eyes," the Mother Superior said, though her lips moved as if repeating a prayer that did not comfort her. But the children were certain. "The lantern is looking for someone," they whispered under the blankets. "And if it stops before your bed, you will not wake." One night the lantern did not keep to the corridor. It entered the dormitory. The children awoke to pale light sliding across their faces, creeping over the rows of beds. The flame swayed like a pendulum, casting long shadows that bent unnaturally, too sharp, too thin. Some children shut their eyes tight, others stared, trembling, their breaths shallow. The lantern passed from one bed to the next, pausing at the foot of each, as though examining the small forms beneath the sheets. When it stopped, it lingered. The flame brightened slightly, a cold illumination that pricked the skin like frost, and then it moved on. By dawn, one bed was empty. The sisters searched the orphanage, combing every room, every corridor, even the grounds. The child was gone. Only her shoes remained, neatly placed outside the dormitory door. That night the lantern returned. Some of the sisters took up vigil, rosaries clutched, lanterns of their own lit. They would confront it, they swore. They would reveal the trick. Yet when the pale glow appeared, their own flames sputtered, dimmed, then died, leaving them blind. Only the unholy lantern remained, drifting closer, swaying gently. The sisters called out, their voices trembling. "Who carries the light? Show yourself." But the lantern gave no answer. It floated past them as though they did not exist, its glow brushing their veils, chilling their skin. One sister reached out to grasp it. Her hand passed through the handle as though it was smoke. But the flame recoiled, shrinking, then flaring suddenly. She screamed, clutching her hand to her chest. The others pulled it away. Her palm was blistered, the skin blackened as if pressed to heated iron. The lantern swayed on, indifferent, and the children, hidden in their beds, whispered once more, "It chooses." It chooses. The Mother Superior forbade further talk. She ordered all lanterns extinguished after Compline. No light was to burn save the eternal candle in the chapel. Yet the pale lantern came still, its glow stronger now, bright enough to outline every nail, every crack, every flaw in the stone. It moved not only through corridors but through walls, as if the orphanage itself could no longer hold it. The sisters saw it from their chambers, slipping beneath door frames. The children swore it hovered at their pillows, breathing its cold light into their dreams. By the 10th night, the orphanage no longer slept. Every creak of wood, every sigh of wind was mistaken for its arrival. And then came the night when the lantern did not leave. It burned in the corridor until dawn, swaying gently, patiently, as though guarding something. The air stank of oil, though none had been spilled. The flame grew thin and sharp, a needle of light piercing the gloom. And in its glow, faint outlines began to appear on the walls. Shadows shaped like children, dozens of them, pressed flat, their hands raised, their faces pale blurs of anguish. The sisters dropped to their knees, praying, weeping, clutching their rosaries as though they were ropes keeping them from drowning. The children pulled their blankets over their heads, but the light passed through, burning even in dreams. And when at last dawn broke, when the first real light pierced the orphanage windows, the lantern was gone. But on the stones of the corridor, directly where it had hung, lay 3 small shoes, burned black, still warm, as though plucked from a fire. And in the shadows behind them, something moved. A veil, a figure, a hand, and the lantern swayed once more, though no one carried it. At the center stood the table, not carved of oak nor fashioned for dining, but a slab of stone so pale it seemed to drink the light. Upon it lay bundles of cloth tied in twine, each parcel stiff with age, spotted dark where moisture and decay had eaten through. The sisters said the cloths once bore prayers embroidered in neat thread, psalms to guard the hands that healed, verses to sanctify the work. But time had turned the white to brown, the words to stains, the prayers to scars. When unwrapped, the instruments gleamed dully even in shadow, needles longer than fingers. Curved hooks meant not for mending cloth but for parting flesh, knives with blades so thin they vanished when turned sideways. No blacksmith of the village admitted to forging them. No physician claimed their design. They were tools of another order, another hunger. It was said that the nun carried them herself, cradled in her arms like relics, whispering to the cloths, as though they could still hear the prayers sewn into their fibers. She brought them always to the same place, the locked chamber at the end of the corridor where the shoes gathered, where the air pressed close and damp. There she placed her chosen child upon the table. The children spoke of it in gasps, their voices brittle as ash. "She touched my face," one whispered, though she bore no mark. "She called my name, though I never told it to her," another confessed, eyes glazed as though half remembering a dream. "And when I woke, I could not speak. For every child that lay upon that slab, silence followed. Some returned, walking, slowly back to their beds, their eyes hollow, their lips pressed tight as though stitched shut from within. Others did not return at all. The sisters offered no answers. Their prayers grew louder, longer, yet their eyes betrayed them. They too had heard the sounds at night, the scrape of metal on stone, the muffled cries that rose and fell like waves, the single piercing clang of a dropped instrument echoing down the corridor. One sister dared to peer through the keyhole. She saw the table bathed in lantern light, its stone glistening as though washed, though the liquid that ran from it was too dark, too thick to be water. And above it, she swore she saw the nun's face, shadowed by her veil, her eyes gleaming, not with reflection but with flame. The sister pulled back, gagging. She said nothing. Within a week she was gone, her room left empty, her habit folded neatly upon her bed. The children told one another that the table could remember, that each mark left upon it, each stain soaked into its veins of stone, was a memory it carried, whispering to the next child laid upon its surface. They said you could feel it through your back, the stories of those before you, the pain etched into its cold skin. One boy returned from it shaking, his voice trembling like a broken string. "It told me things," he murmured, lips cracked. "What things?" the others pressed. "That I was not the first, that I would not be the last, that it was still hungry." After that, he did not speak again. The table grew busier in those weeks. Each night another child was led down the corridor, their shoes left neatly behind, their breaths growing shallower as the lantern's pale glow guided them into shadow. The sisters stopped counting, for the numbers no longer mattered. The silence spread, swallowing voices, swallowing laughter, until the dormitories held only the sound of restless breathing and the faint scrape of shoes that no longer moved by will. And then came the night when 2 sisters vanished. Their rosaries were found upon the table, the beads slick, the crucifixes bent. The instruments lay unwrapped, their edges glistening as though freshly baptized. The air reeked of oil and iron. The Mother Superior forbade the chamber's door from being touched again, but the children whispered that the table no longer needed to be entered. It would come. They said they dreamed of lying upon its surface, the stone cold beneath their spines, the needles hovering above like stars waiting to fall. They woke clutching their throats, their hands trembling as though pierced. And then, one dawn, the corridor changed. The sisters found the chamber door wide open, though the key still hung from the Mother Superior's belt. The table stood bare, its surface scrubbed clean, yet every stone in the corridor was lined with shoes, far more than the children could account for, far more than the orphanage had ever held. The air was heavy, clotted with silence. The lantern burned in the doorway, its pale light trembling, and for the first time the table moved. It slid forward, scraping against the stone, dragging itself inch by inch into the hall, as though pulled by hands no one could see. The bundles of cloth trembled upon its surface, one unraveling, letting a needle roll free. The sound of its fall was sharp, ringing, endless. The children screamed, the sisters wept, and the table kept coming. The sound began as a thread so thin it could be mistaken for the groaning of the rafters, but then it swelled into a hymn that carried through the bones of the orphanage, a song sung by no living mouth. The sisters swore the chapel was locked at night, bolted with iron that had been blessed twice, yet when the children huddled in their cots clutching each other for warmth, the voice would rise from the chapel floor clear, hollow, unbroken by the need for air. It was not the timbre of a child alive, nor the cracked mutter of age. It was glass stretched thin across fire, brittle and piercing, a melody that pulled. Tears from their eyes, though none knew its words. The older girls whispered that the singer was Maria, the one who had been buried beneath the crooked elm in the yard, her grave marked only by a stone with no name, her body wrapped hastily when the fever claimed her in winter. Yet Maria had been the one who sang most sweetly, her voice brightening even the blackest mornings. And now, when the chapel filled with sound, it was unmistakably hers, only sharpened, emptied of warmth, a song severed from lungs and breath. Some nights the orphans dared creep close to the chapel door, bare feet silent against the cold floor, pressing their ears to the wood, hoping to catch the forbidden syllables that no priest dared translate from. Within, the voice would shift, rising from hymn into something darker, a dirge, slow and dragging, as if stones were being pulled through the earth, each note heavier than the last, each pause deeper than the silence of a tomb. "I can't breathe," whispered one child as she pressed her ear to the door, her lips trembling. "Yet she sings as if she does for all of us." The others pulled her back, for they feared the sound might slip through cracks and enter them. They had been told never to answer, never to hum along, for once the hymn entered your chest, you would sing in your sleep until your lips turned blue. One boy, Matteo, did not listen, for he had loved Maria most dearly when she lived, and when her voice returned he lay awake, humming softly into his pillow, matching her unholy tune in the morning. His skin was pale and his lips tinged violet, but worse, when the sisters demanded he speak, no sound came from his throat. His voice had been taken, drawn into her eternal hymn that night. Two voices sang in the chapel. The orphans could no longer bear it. Some stuffed their ears with straw, others pressed their faces into blankets to muffle the sound, yet the notes crept in regardless, sliding beneath doors, curling through shutters like smoke. The sisters, too, began to tremble, their rosaries clutched so tight the beads cracked in their hands, for they knew the truth whispered in the oldest records of the convent, that some voices are not extinguished in death, but preserved, chained, and bound to stone, sustained by the prayers that rot instead of rise on the seventh night. The lanterns flickered and went out. The children swore they saw a shadow moving between pews, a girl with hair falling in strings of soil, her lips blackened, her chest unmoving, and yet her mouth opening wide to pour out endless sound. The hymn cut sharp, like knives dragged against bone, until all who heard it were bent forward, clutching, their stomachs weeping, choking on words they did not know but almost remembered. When silence finally fell, the chapel door creaked open on its own, and on the threshold lay a small wooden crucifix, splintered, soaked in earth, as though it had been dug from her grave by hand. The orphans did not dare touch it, but as they turned away, they heard it. The faintest intake of air, the promise of another song, rising from lips that should not breathe, and somewhere outside, by the crooked elm, the soil of Maria's grave had shifted, as if something beneath had begun to stir. They said her veil had once been white as altar linen, pure as snow fallen on a convent roof. But by the time the children learned to whisper her name only in secrecy, the cloth had turned heavy, shadowed and wet, though no hand had washed. It was not dirt that clung to the fabric, nor the dust of candle smoke. It was weight, the invisible kind that dragged upon the soul, and each night, when she returned from her hidden work, the veil would hang lower, sagging as if pulled down by invisible fingers. The orphans counted, though they dared not speak the number aloud. 56 girls had lain upon the table by, then 56 who had either returned changed and hollow, or had not returned at all. The veil bore their burden, or so the children believed, for it darkened in uneven blotches, like stains that seeped outward from a wound too deep to close. And though the cloth was dry to sight, those who brushed against it swore their palms came away damp, not water, whispered one girl, clutching her hand as if burned. It is sorrow. It is what they left behind. The sisters of the convent refused to speak of it, yet when they passed her in the corridors, they stepped aside, eyes lowered. For the veil swung heavy like a pendulum of judgment, trailing dampness that left no mark upon the floor, yet marked every heart that beheld it. In the dim chapel light, the veil sometimes seemed to pulse, shadows crawling upward as though alive, and the children swore it moved even when she stood still, as though unseen lips beneath it whispered prayers that no ear should hear one night, when the wind rattled the windows and sleep would not come. 2 girls, Isabel and Rosa, dared each other to touch the veil as the nun knelt in vigil. They crept forward, small feet silent as moth wings, and when Isabel's hand brushed the edge of the fabric, her lips parted against her will. Words spilled. From her mouth, words she had never learned. A prayer in a tongue older than the stones of the chapel itself, her eyes wide, her body trembling as though a current passed through her veins. Rosa pulled her back, breaking the contact, and the veil swung gently, dripping silence. But Isabel could not stop humming after that night, a tune low, unbroken, endless. Her voice a thread tangled into the nun's black veil. The orphans grew fearful, for it was said that with each soul claimed, the veil grew heavier, darker, until at last it would sink to the ground, and when it did, the weight of the dead would crush the walls around them. Some swore they saw faces in the folds, pressed against the cloth as if suffocating behind it, children's mouths frozen open, eyes wide with pleading, vanishing when the lantern was lifted. Closer at dawn, when the nun walked the yard, the veil swayed though no wind stirred, and droplets fell from its hem, sinking into the earth, leaving no stain on the ground but spreading shadows in the air, shadows that lingered long after she. Past one boy, Thomas whispered the forbidden thought aloud. The veil is not stained, it is fed. He was taken that night, his bed empty by morning, and though the sisters denied he had ever been there, the veil hung lower the next day, heavier, darker, as though Tomas's very breath had been stitched into its threads. When the moon was high, some children pressed their faces to the cracked chapel window, and swore they saw her lifting the veil from her head, holding it aloft with both hands, the fabric dripping, though the floor below remained dry, and from within its folds came a faint, muffled sound. A chorus, voices pressed together, too many to name, humming like bees trapped in a jar. The children fled before the sight could swallow them whole, but one thought gnawed at their dreams, that the veil was not cloth at all, but a shroud stitched from the breath of the lost, and that one night when it fell entirely black it would be lowered across them all, and as dawn broke pale and weak, the orphans woke to find the veil hanging at the chapel door, pinned there by no hand, its dripping hem brushing the stone, a stain spreading outward that no light could cleanse. It was not the sound of bells nor the dripping veil that most haunted the children of the orphanage. It was the book, the ledger, the endless register of names, and the inkwell from which it drank. They found it on a narrow desk in a room no One remembered being unlocked, a heavy oak table where dust dared not gather, for the book lay open each dawn as though freshly written, names inscribed in a hand neither firm nor faltering, a script that breathed, curling and twisting like veins beneath pale skin. The ink shimmered strangely, not flat and black like candle soot dissolved in water, but red at the edges, pulsing, with a dull, wet glisten, as though each letter was stitched from something still living. No scholar, no priest, no wandering Jesuit could decipher the hand, yet the children swore they knew the names, for when their turn came, the letters shimmered. Louder, and their own reflection bent inside the liquid strokes, one boy, Matteo, dared whisper, "It is not writing, it is remembering." And from that night forward he woke each dawn with new bruises, patterns blooming across his skin, shapes that mirrored the loops and curls of the book's cursed script. The nun was seen at her desk, long, past midnight, her hands clasped in prayer as she bent toward the inkwell, but no one heard the scratch of a quill. Instead, they heard the faintest trickle, a sound like drops falling into water, though no candle trembled, no storm shook the roof. One child swore she saw the truth, that the nun never lifted a pen at all, her finger itself dipped into the ink, drawn upward wet and glistening, and, when pressed to the page, the words unfurled on their own, writhing like worms unearthed in rain. The book grew heavier as the weeks passed, its spine straining, pages swollen, and the children whispered that it was not parchment at all, but skin, turned brittle with age, stitched together by hands that never sought forgiveness. The sisters of the convent forbade the orphans from looking upon it, yet still they crept, lanterns hidden in their palms, for they swore each night the book opened to a new page, and with it another bed in the dormitory lay empty come morning. "Why must she write us?" Rosa whispered, her lip trembling, as she ran her finger near but not upon the living ink, and Isabel answered with eyes wide as the dead, "So heaven will not forget who to claim." But heaven was silent, and the book kept filling, one storm-torn night. Lightning cracked the sky and illuminated the desk. The children saw the inkwell for what it truly was, not brass, not glass, but bone. The hollowed fragment of a skull, its edge darkened where lips had once pressed, and from within it the ink still trembled, as though a heartbeat at the bottom, pumping ceaselessly. A child fainted at the sight, but the others stared, unable to turn away, for the surface of the ink did not ripple aimlessly. It carried shapes, tiny mouths gasping, hands pressing upward from beneath as though drowning. Each stroke of the book nothing more than their final breath preserved on the page, and worse still, the children knew the numbers did not match, for the book was thicker than the years of the orphanage itself, names reaching back before their births and forward still, pages already waiting, blank but restless, thirsting to be filled. Matteo, who had once spoken too boldly, disappeared at dawn, his bed empty, his blanket folded, but his name glistened dark upon the open page, still wet as though written in that very moment, and from then on none dared speak their fears, for fear itself seemed to coax the ink alive. Letters writhing like maggots when breath fell too close. The last child to look swore the ink shifted as she leaned near, forming not words, but a reflection. Her own face staring back at her, but older, bloodless, hollow-eyed, a face she had not yet grown into, and as she fled, tripping down the stairs, the book snapped shut on its own, the sound like a rib breaking, and in the silence that followed, the inkwell bled slowly over the desk, a single drop sliding down the skull's hollow, falling to the stone floor below, where it hissed like water upon flame. When the children returned at dawn, the book was open once more, and the next page already bore a name that none of them recognized. Yet the space where her bed had been was empty, and from the open door, the veil itself swayed, dripping slowly toward the desk, as though drawn to drink from the inkwell's endless mouth. The walls were never still, not in daylight when prayers were chanted, not in night silence when even the bells refused to toll, for they swelled and sank like lungs straining against the ribs of stone, breathing in a rhythm too slow, too patient to belong to anything human. Those who entered swore their candles flickered not with wind, but with exhalations. A damp warmth pressed against their cheeks, carrying the musk of earth left too long in shadow, and the metallic tang of something buried deeper still. At first the children thought it was only imagination, that the drafts of old masonry played cruel tricks. But the breath grew stronger in the dormitories where the walls rose close and narrow, and small hands reached out in the dark to touch the stone, finding it not cold but clammy, like skin too long without sunlight. "Listen," one girl whispered to her companion beneath a tattered blanket, her ear pressed to the wall. "They are crying." And indeed, when one pressed close, the stone quivered faintly as if something stirred beneath, and a muffled voice seeped through, not one voice but many, layered upon one another like centuries of grief compressed into mortar. The visitors who came to deliver bread or cloth refused to linger, for they too heard the faint susurrations, the sighs that seemed to follow them through the corridors. And one merchant fled mid-offering, dropping his basket, when a single wet breath traced the back of his neck. The sisters of the convent dismissed it as nonsense, yet even they avoided leaning too near the walls. And when questioned, their silence said more than denial ever could. The orphans began to mark the spots where the breath was strongest, placing small stones or scraps of thread upon the floor, until one night they noticed the pattern it formed, a crude outline of rooms that no longer existed, chambers sealed off by mortar long before they had been born. "What is behind them?" Rosa asked, her finger trembling against the map traced in chalk, and Isabel, who had seen the inkwell bleed and the veil drip, only answered with a whisper, "Not what, but who," for the cries were too sharp, too desperate to belong to wind. They rose at night when storms clawed the windows, and when thunder shook the roof, the walls themselves seemed to groan, cracks widening for an instant to release the sound of pleading voices, children calling for mothers who never came, prayers, half-formed, screams swallowed too quickly. Some swore they saw fingers press outward through the stone, tiny at first, pale and desperate, only to vanish when touched, leaving behind trails of dampness like tears sliding down stone cheeks. The nun walked those halls without fear, her veil dripping, her lantern pale, and when she paused before the trembling walls, the cries ceased, as if every voice inside was holding its breath, waiting for her to pass, waiting for her permission to speak again. One boy, bold with terror, struck the stone with his fist, demanding to know what lay hidden within. And the wall answered with a hollow echo, a deep exhale that shook the floor and left his knuckles wet, smeared with something darker than dust. By dawn he was gone, his bed empty, his name inked freshly in the book, and the stone where he had struck was warm to the touch, as though it had swallowed him whole. The children lived then with the knowledge that the orphanage was no mere house. It was a body, its bones stacked in mortar, its veins running in cracks where whispers bled through, its lungs expanding and contracting with damp sorrow. Breathing through every corridor one night, the cries grew louder than ever before, no longer muffled but frantic, the walls quivering as if straining to break free of their own foundations, and the children pressed their ears to the stone, hearing names, their own names, spoken back to them in voices that should not have known them. "Help us," the voices pleaded, "or join us." And as the lantern light guttered, the cracks began to split wider, shadows spilling forth like smoke, twisting into the shapes of hands, mouths, hollow-eyed children clawing to escape. The orphans screamed, but the nun only raised her veil, its dripping hem brushing the trembling stone, and at her touch the walls inhaled sharply, drawing the shadows back into their prison when silence returned. The walls gleamed wet as though freshly washed in breath, and a faint heartbeat pulsed within them, slow, deliberate, patient as eternity. By morning, the chalk-marked map had spread wider on its own, lines creeping along the floorboards, tracing a room none had dared imagine, a chamber sealed not by stone but by psalms carved in desperation, and from behind that wall, something knocked, steady as a hand upon a coffin lid, waiting for the next night to come. It was said a single flame ruled the orphanage, not the sun that broke through the clouds, nor the lanterns that swung weakly in the corridors, but the candle that burned without pause upon her desk, its light trembling, yet never dying, as if it carried within it the secret breath of every child brought before it by day. The flame was small, pale, a frail thing that seemed ready to fade. Yet even in that weakness it never surrendered, and by night it grew taller, leaning forward when the nun leaned forward, recoiling when a child dared draw too near. No hand could snuff it out, not when pressed with damp fingers, not when covered by glass, not when drowned in water drawn fresh from the convent well, for each attempt ended the same. The flames sputtered, hissed, then flared back brighter, as though mocking the effort, as though laughing silently in the dark. The orphans knew the candle well, for each was brought before it in turn, made to kneel in its flickering glow, while the nun whispered prayers. Into the veil that hung damp across her face, some swore the flame bent toward them, curling like a finger beckoning closer, and when it swayed it cast shadows that crawled across the walls, shadows not their own, but shapes of children who should not have been there. One girl, Esperanza, whispered trembling, "It is not fire. It is watching us." And indeed the flame seemed to quiver like an eye struggling to stay open, blinking in slow, deliberate pulses whenever a child wept in its glow. The sisters of the convent did not speak of the candle, but their silence betrayed them, for none would walk too close, none would let their habits brush against the desk. And when the nun passed with her dripping veil, the flame shivered as though bowing in reverence on storm-torn nights, when the wind shrieked and the roof shook with thunder, every candle in the orphanage guttered, every lantern hissed into blackness, but the one upon her desk only grew stronger, its flame licking higher, throwing shadows longer, until the whole chamber seemed to kneel before it. The children believed the flame fed upon something, not wax, not wick, but souls, and they counted with trembling lips how many nights it had burned since Thomas, since Rosa, since Matteo, each name. A silence the candle had swallowed whole at times. The nun dipped her finger into the flame, and though no flesh burned, the candle's light would stretch outward, crawling across the walls as though seeking, as though hungering, casting shadows of beds that stood empty, casting faces of children whose bodies had long since disappeared. A visitor once attempted to steal the candle, believing it a relic worth fortunes, but the moment he grasped it, the flame leapt onto his skin, crawled up his arm like a living serpent, and sank into his chest with a hiss. His body dropped lifeless. Yet his face lingered for a moment in the flame, mouth open in a scream that made no sound, before the candle shrank once more to its patient flicker. The orphans dared not touch it after that, yet they could not look away, for the flame had begun to change, its core no longer gold but crimson, a slow pulse thudding within it in rhythm with the walls that breathed, in rhythm with the knocking behind the sealed chamber. Esperanza swore the flame whispered, when the nun bent close, that the fire itself gave her words in a tongue older than Scripture, a litany meant not for heaven, but for the earth beneath the foundations, the soil that drank too much, the stone that remembered too well. And when she finished her midnight prayer, the candle always flared, its light expanding like lungs filled too quickly, before settling back, satisfied, sated, alive. One night the children gathered in secret, a circle of trembling hands and desperate whispers, determined to end the flame, to bury it, crush it, silence it forever. They carried cloth, they carried water, they carried stones from the yard, and together they rushed upon the desk, snuffing the flame beneath their offerings, pressing until smoke rose, pressing until they believed it gone. But when they pulled back, the candle stood unbroken, its flame taller than before, and in that moment each child saw themselves reflected in the fire, not as they were, but as they would be, pale, hollow, lifeless, their eyes sunken, their lips sealed in silence. The candle swayed gently, and one by one the children collapsed to their knees, breath stolen, hearts racing to match the rhythm of the flame's pulse. By dawn the candle still burned, its wick untouched, its wax unspent. The floor around the desk stained not with wax drippings, but with thin red trails, as though the flame had bled instead of melted, and from the corner of the room, where the wall pressed darkest, the sound began again. A steady knock, measured, patient, echoing like a coffin lid beneath the earth, calling them toward the room sealed with psalms. The first sound was not a knock but a sigh, as though the stones themselves remembered what they had been forced to contain. The chamber stood at the farthest reach of the orphanage, beyond stairwells that had rotted into crooked spines, beyond corridors where plaster peeled like shed skin, until only a single wall remained, bricked with haste yet marked with care, every stone carved with words of pleading, of terror, of surrender. The psalms were etched not in ink, but in fingernail, scrapes in ash mixed with blood, in crude strokes that made holy verses look like curses scratched against heaven's gate. They said the chamber had once been a nursery, but no cradle was ever found inside, only a door that had been erased by brick, as though the nuns themselves feared what slept beyond it more than the devil who might enter from without at night. When the building fell into its hollow silence, the wall stirred, a slow, deliberate thud echoed from within, the rhythm too measured to be accident, too patient to be wind, a sound like knuckles rapping against wood that no longer existed. Children who slept nearby swore they heard words between the knocks, not in any language they knew, but in a cadence that made their teeth ache, syllables thick as damp earth pressed into their ears. One orphan, older than the rest, dared to press his cheek against the wall, and when the knock came again, his face turned pale, his lips trembling. "It is not asking to be let out," he whispered, voice cracked. "It is asking who will take its place." After that he was never seen again, only his bed left unmade, the sheets drawn tight as if tucked by invisible hands. Psalms themselves had begun to change, witnesses said, the carved verses softening, their edges smoothing, as if the words were being worn down from the inside, erased by breaths too damp to be human. The priest who first discovered it in the ledgers claimed the wall bled when touched, but no record was kept of his fate, only a note in a trembling hand. "Seal it deeper, seal it darker. The heart still beats." Years passed, the orphanage emptied, and yet the chamber remained untouched, its bricks swollen with moisture, its prayers fading into illegibility, and always the sound, knock, knock, knock. The rhythm had grown slower, heavier, like a pendulum counting not seconds but centuries, marking time for something no longer human, yet still alive. Local masons hired to repair the structure refused to approach it, saying the wall was warmer than flesh, damp with breath, that fogged in winter air. One swore he heard weeping seep through the mortar, not the voice of a child, but something older, cracked with centuries, as if the stone itself had learned grief. Another man fled shrieking when the knock came beneath his palm, saying the heartbeat followed him down the road, drumming in his chest until he collapsed in a ditch. Even now those who dare to walk the ruins claim the wall hums, a resonance that pulls at the marrow, a lullaby of stone and bone and scripture. Broken in half at dusk, the shadow along that corridor lingers longer than any other, thick as smoke, and those who listen too long swear they can hear breath drawn from within, ragged, eager, almost near, and if you lean close enough, too close, you will see that the mortar between the bricks is not crumbling stone, but something that swells, soft as skin, as though the wall itself is growing. One day, the prayers will wear through, the psalms will collapse into silence, and the knocking will not be answered but fulfilled. And when it does, the wall will fall outward, not inward, carrying with it the sound of lungs filling after centuries, and the smell of soil that never knew a grave. The last words carved into the lowest stone, barely legible beneath mold, read simply, "Forgive us." It would not stop singing. The knock sounded again, steady as a heartbeat, patient as eternity. And with each pulse the mortar swelled, cracked, and began to bleed. The first crack opened like a mouth, and what seeped through was not dust but warmth, slick as blood, ancient as soil, wrong as birth in the absence of breath. Children once whispered that the wall was not meant to keep something inside, but to keep the living from touching what had already spread beneath the foundations, fingers crawling where eyes could not follow, clutching ankles in the dark. They said the stones themselves had been fed with marrow ground fine, with teeth pressed into mortar, with prayers swallowed before the amen could be spoken, until the wall was less built than grown. When the knocking grew louder, a mason returned, this one drunk enough to think himself immune to curses, and he laid his hand flat against the brick, laughing at the tremor beneath. The laugh did not last. The wall shuddered as if taking his touch into itself, and when he tried to pull away, his palm did not come free, the skin stretching, tearing, until something unseen took hold of him from the other side, tugging with gentle patience. He screamed, the sound swallowed by stone, and when others ran to pull him back, they found only the sleeve of his coat left clinging to mortar, damp and red at the seam. The knock changed after that, no longer steady, no longer patient, but eager, arrhythmic, a dozen tiny thumps echoing at once, as if many fists, many hands, had joined in chorus. "Beneath the stones, children," one of the nuns whispered in terror. "Those are children's hands." But even she would not press her ear closer to be certain, for fear the stone would kiss her and never let her go. The psalms carved into the bricks began to warp then, curling like letters written in heat, the words softening into shapes that writhed, their prayers splitting into cries, not of mercy, but of hunger. The walls seemed to breathe deeper, their dampness slicker, their warmth more insistent, and the knocking grew into a rhythm like desperate feet pacing beneath the ground. Some nights the corridor itself seemed shorter, as if the wall was inching outward, swelling with every heartbeat, hungering for the touch of living flesh, and always when one lingered too long there came a whisper, not from behind the wall but beneath the soles of their feet, a hushed litany rising up through the stone floor, too low to decipher, too human to ignore. One word was clear, repeated in countless voices, a name lost from the orphan ledgers long ago, a name the earth still remembered, though no priest dared to speak it aloud. When the wall cracked further, when the mortar began to pulse like veins, when the stones shifted not by gravity but by breath, the orphans swore they saw fingers, pale and long, pressing outward as if testing the air, tapping the rhythm of a prayer that had no God. And one night, a candle flame bent toward it, not away, as though drawn by the hunger behind the bricks. The corridor has never known silence since, for what lies behind no longer knocks for release. It waits with its many hands to pull through anyone foolish enough to lean too close, and the question remains, whispered even now by those who dare speak of the place, if the hands are reaching out, then what are the voices calling in? It began not with knocking but with humming, low at first like bees caught in a jar, then swelling into chords no human throat should sustain. The villagers swore they heard it through the chapel's stones, a chorus of voices woven tight as rope, rising and falling like waves of black water against the shore. Not Latin, not Spanish, not any tongue the priests could bless, yet it echoed with the weight of Scripture, the shape of prayers spoken in reverse, hymns sung in devotion, not to God, but to what writhed in silence each night. The song grew stronger, and the walls themselves vibrated with the sound, dust sifting from the ceiling as though the stones could no longer contain the hymn that had no end. One nun pressed her ear to the bricks, trembling, and swore she heard children among the choir, their small voices stretched thin, singing without breath, singing without pause, singing with a joy that was sharper than grief. When she staggered back, her hair had turned white, though her lips still moved silently, repeating the last note she had heard, as if she carried the choir now within her chest. Others joined unwillingly. Those who stayed too long in the corridor found themselves humming in their sleep, lips moving against their will, their voices braiding with the unseen choir until even silence carried melody. The priests tried to drown it with their bells, but the bells cracked, their bronze ringing hollow, swallowed by the deeper resonance that rose from behind the wall. "The choir is not trapped," whispered one terrified novice scout. "We are." And still, the wall breathed with sound, exhaling warm, damp air that smelled of copper and oil, carrying with it the faint echo of children, laughing where no children remained on the 12th night. A lantern flame bent toward the wall and did not return upright, frozen as if listening, its light trembling in time with the hidden song. Then, for the first time, the choir paused. The silence was worse than the singing, thick as wool, heavy as earth upon a coffin, until a single voice spoke clear through the mortar. A voice too young to bear such weight, it whispered only 3 words. Yet the corridor seemed to lean forward to hear them. "Let us out." And from that moment every candle in the orphanage guttered in the same rhythm, flickering not to the breath of wind, but to the heartbeat of a hymn that was no longer behind the wall, But everywhere, it was first noticed by the altar boy, who swore the crucifix above the chapel had changed color, its wood darkening as though it drank from some unseen well. At dawn it shone blacker than night, and at dusk it wept, not with wax from the candles, nor dew from the morning, but with a thin red seep that glistened along the nailed hands of Christ. They called it a miracle at first, pilgrims coming barefoot to kneel beneath it, pressing their lips to the droplets, whispering desperate prayers, believing the blood was sanctified. But those who touched their mouths to it came away colder, their lips bruised blue, their whispers never ending, muttering verses no priest had taught, verses that coiled in the ear like serpents. The nuns began to hear the muttering in the dormitories, children stirring in sleep, their hands clasped not in prayer but twisted into shapes, resembling the bent limbs on the crucifix. One elder nun, shivering, lifted her eyes and saw the eyes of the carving flicker, not the painted gaze of wood, but something deeper, shifting, as if the Christ upon the cross was watching them from beneath layers of shadow and stain. The hymns of the hidden choir behind the wall seemed to thread into it, the crucifix vibrating faintly with each note, droplets of blood falling heavier. Whenever the song swelled, it listens, whispered one orphan girl, too pale, too thin, her eyes locked on the cross as though she saw more than the others. It listens through him. That night, the chapel doors shuddered closed on their own, and the crucifix glowed faintly in the dark, a pulse like a vein, casting thin red light over the pews. The children woke screaming, not from dreams, but from a sound, the creak of wood stretching, the faint groan of nails, as though the figure nailed to the cross had shifted its weight, straining against its burden. Some swore they saw the arms move ever so slightly, pulling at the nails, the wood bleeding thicker where iron met flesh. By morning, the blood was pooled beneath it, dark and clotted, but warm to the touch, as though it had only just fallen, and carved faintly into the base. Letters no one had ever seen before were names, 56 in number, the same as the children the records had forgotten, each letter still dripping as though freshly carved by a hand unseen. The crucifix was no longer a symbol of salvation but of covenant, and the covenant was not broken. And in the silence that followed, the choir behind the wall began to sing again, their voices rising, their song weaving into the wood until the figure upon the cross opened its mouth ever so slightly, not to speak but to breathe.